Who will end Vladimir Putin's murderous regime? Now, let's look at some of the individual pro-democracy activists who comprise the resistance. First and foremost is the incomparable Alexei Navalny. In his defiance of the regime, he has become a symbol of courage for anti-Putin Russians everywhere. He has been tortured, poisoned, arrested, and now in prison, and yet still campaigns against his oppressors from behind bars. Next is Lyubov Sogol, Navalny's associate and anti-corruption lawyer, who has been actively fighting against corruption and electoral fraud from within Russia. She is a leader in Navalny's anti-corruption foundation. She is young, she is feisty, and she will surely be a critical voice in a post-Putin Russia. Watch her and follow her on social media. And Lyubov, return my emails. Then there's Vladimir Kara-Murza, a fearless journalist and opposition leader who campaigns for political rights and defense of political prisoners. In April of 2023, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for criticizing the war in Ukraine, and yet he remains defiant. Then there's the one-time oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, former head of Yukol's oil company and once considered the richest man in Russia. He spent 10 years in a Russian prison for his defiance of the Putin regime, and he's pretty pissed off about it. Now in exile in the UK, he continues to advocate for democracy and development of civic society in Russia through his organization, the Russian Action Committee. Mikhail, return my emails. Then there's Garry Kasparov, who is widely considered one of the best chess players of all time. He's become an outspoken Putin critic and tireless advocate for human rights and democracy in Russia. Finally, there are Maria Alyukina and Nadia Tolokonnikov, members of the punk rock group Pussy Riot, which might be the greatest band name in history. Now in exile in the West, they continue to use their music, performance art, and social media to relentlessly mock Putin and promote political and social change in Russia. They also do not return my emails. Maybe it's just a Russian thing. These are but a few of Russia's prominent dissidents promoting change in Russia, but there are many more. If you're interested, look up Ruslan Khasbulatov, Sergei Parkhomenko, Liv Ponomarev, and Ilya Yashin. Now, if you find all the information about the imprisonments, the executions, and the shuttering of pro-democracy organizations in Russia depressing, take heart. There are organizations operating in exile who continue to plan for a democratic Russia after the inevitable fall of Vladimir Putin. First, there is Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation. Founded in 2011, the FBK strives to hold corrupt officials and organizations accountable using legal actions, public protests, and social media campaigns. Despite Navalny's imprisonment, the FBK is alive and well. Now run by Maria Pevkich from Lithuania, it continues to launch its investigations via members still living underground in Russia. The FBK will surely be a critical voice in building a post-Putin Russia. Now, historically, the Russian opposition has been weak and divided, but there are some signs that is changing. For instance, there's the Free Russia Foundation, a coalition comprised of activists, policymakers, and intellectuals from Russia and around the world, organized by Garry Kasparov. They are headquartered in Washington, D.C., but have regional offices across Western and Eastern Europe. They have been meeting annually at the Free Russia Forum in Vilnius, Lithuania, since 2016. The forum focuses on promoting democracy, human rights, and freedom of speech in Russia, and on fostering international cooperation in support of these goals. But perhaps the most promising development in the Russian pro-democracy movement in the past several decades has been the assembly of over 200 representatives of Russia's opposition groups at the EU Parliament in Brussels in early June of this year. At the initiative of Lithuanian MEP Andrius Kubilius, the two-day conference discussed the long-term strategy for the formation of a democratic Russia. Furthermore, in preparation for that conference, around 70 anti-war and opposition groups comprised of journalists, human rights defenders, and lawyers gathered in Berlin in April at the behest of former oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. In a significant development, they agreed to the Declaration of Russian Democratic Forces, which has now been signed by over 30,000 Russians. The declaration included 5 stipulations: One, that the war against Ukraine is criminal and the borders of Ukraine must be restored. Two, that the Putin regime is criminal, therefore it must be removed. We couldn't agree more. And third, the furtherance of imperialist policy is unacceptable. Fourth, political prisoners and prisoners of war must be released. And finally, they express solidarity with those Russians who have the courage to express anti-Putin and anti-war stances, and with those tens of millions who refuse to participate in the regime's crimes. While the opposition does seem to be coalescing, divisions remain. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Garry Kasparov seem to be aligned, but it's not clear to what extent Alexei Navalny supports their efforts. In fact, Navalny's FBK abstained from the declaration of Russian democratic forces, prompting speculation he may have objected to the return of all lands to Ukraine per its 1991 borders, or to its stipulation of compensation for Ukraine. We've even been told by one prominent opposition figure Navalny wants to be the only leader of the opposition, which sounds very ominous. Only Alexei Navalny and his associates know the reason, but Russia clearly needs these three men to be united to spur a revolution to grant liberty to the Russian people. Regardless, look for more in the coming months from these coalitions. We would not be surprised if their next step was to forge a constitution for a post-Putin Russia. Liberation Media strongly encourages the coalition to do just that. But no matter how much momentum the pro-democracy movement gathers, it won't succeed without support of the Russian military. It is likely the only organization powerful enough to topple the Putin regime. The Russian military has been historically completely subservient to the state, but as the Prigozhin mutiny illustrates, we could be just a few defections away from a full-scale revolt. The question will be what form of government such a mutiny would create and with whom they would align themselves. Let's look at some of the key military figures who may be powerful enough to mount a challenge to Putin. First, there is the volatile ex-convict Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner Group, a private army which has been employed by the Russian military during its recent forays into Syria, Sudan, and Ukraine. As you have likely heard, Prigozhin rebelled against the Russian military leadership in late June and even captured the Russian nerve center of the Ukraine war, Rostov, before abruptly calling off his mutiny. Prigozhin claimed he was not attempting a coup, so his endgame was unclear. Suffice to say, it's unlikely this madman would help cultivate a democracy in Russia, and we believe his chances of rising again from exile in Belarus to challenge Putin are slim. Next is Sergei Shoigu, who has served as the Minister of Defense since 2012 and wields significant influence in the Russian military. He is known for his effective management skills and his focus on modernizing the armed forces. He has historically been very close to Vladimir Putin, but we've seen Putin publicly snub him in the wake of Prigozhin's mutiny, and he may be on his way out. Could an embittered Shoigu cast his lot with the opposition and swing the Russian military in its favor? Stay tuned. Then there's General Sergei Surovikin, dubbed General Armageddon for his ruthless tactics in Syria. He led the Russian campaign in Ukraine from October 22 through January of 23 and has served alongside Prigozhin. Although demoted from his supreme commander role in January, Surovikin retains significant power and is very popular with the troops. However, after the rebellion ended, he was detained and questioned about his links to Prigozhin, and he has not been seen since. Could he too have turned against Putin? We may never find out. Then there is General Valery Gerasimov, who serves as the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russia. He is widely regarded as the architect of Russia's military strategy and was named Supreme Commander of the Ukraine War when Surovikin was demoted in January. He was one of the main targets of Prigozhin's mutiny, and there are rumors he too may be on his way out. Unfortunately, there is no evidence to suggest any of these men have any regard for democracy, but each of them now has motive to turn on the Putin regime. Only time will tell if the pro-democracy camp can take advantage of these rifts and bring the military to its side. There is some good news on this front. We've been told by a high-ranking Russian Action Committee member that Mikhail Khodorkovsky has been working to forge ties to the military to do just that. Her source also noted there's widespread anti-Putin and anti-war sentiment among the upper ranks of the Russian military. Thus, our prediction is that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, in partnership with one or more of these men, will lead a transitional government that finally leads to a Russian democracy. We certainly hope he does. It would be the first step in granting freedom to over 140 million people. Long live the great Russian people, and long live the resistance.